Now, NDE Radio, a weekly exploration of near-death experiences and similar encounters with the other side. Now, here's your host, Lee Witting.
Welcome to NDE Radio with Lee Witting. Whether you're listening on TalkZone, by podcast, through the archives of our ad-free shows on our YouTube channel, or by connecting through our Facebook page. It's not the into the light NDEs that do so much to convince others that our consciousness survives death, but rather the out-of-body observations and realizations that convince us and persuade others of our eternal nature. Additional proof evolves as out-of-body experiences often profoundly change the direction of the experiencer's life as well. A powerful testimony to that fact, and one that's convinced thousands, has come through the clear-eyed OBE description provided by Barbara Bartolome through this show and through her years of work with IANDS as well. When a medical procedure went wrong through a stupid mistake, Barbara's OBE and life direction ultimately led to the discovery of her NDE at 18 months old, explaining the intuitive and spiritual gifts that forgotten death had provided her. The medical details she observed in the hospital, such as the full-force blows to her chest, the eternal friend she encountered on the hospital ceiling, and the discovery of her ice bath death as an infant, probably from measles, left her with no fear of dying and matured her into a direct sensed connection with God. Barbara, tell the audience about your near-death experience while you were being prepped for back surgery.
Yeah. I was 31 years old with a 3-month-old little baby girl and an 8-year-old son. And I went in for the spinal discectomy, laminectomy that was happening. And they wanted to do, prior to the surgery the next day, they wanted to do a myelogram where they inject iodine dye into your spinal column. And they did that at the back of my neck. And they had me laying on an x-ray table. And normally this procedure is done and they get the results and they go on with the surgery and everything goes well. They told me to hold really still, and I was following directions. And after they had injected the dye, a person who was with the x-ray tech started moving the x-ray table by putting his finger on a button and pushing it. So the table was supposed to raise where my head went up and my feet went down so that gravity would take the dye down my spine, and it didn't happen that way because he just mistakenly pushed the wrong button on the machine. So he didn't know that was happening, and I felt immediate kind of confusion, and I started feeling funny, and I didn't know what was going on, and I wasn't sure if it was what was supposed to be happening, so I didn't say anything. And by the time I realized that I should say something, that I was feeling as though I was going to black out, it was too late, and I started hyperventilating, and he noticed then that I was in distress, and the last thing I saw before I did black out was him leaning over the x-ray table looking at me and then leaning back to see where his thumb was, and then looking like, oh my God, face on him. So when I blacked out, there was no loss of consciousness. I was in my body one moment, and when I shut my eyes and lost it, then I was up on the ceiling. And I had never known anything about NDEs. I'd never heard of them. And I looked down at my body and the top of his head, and I went, if I'm up here and, he's down there, and he started calling code blue, and the room started going into a panic mode, I must be dead. And it wasn't very distressing to me at all. It was I felt very calm and very centered, and I felt wrapped in love and just in a very peaceful place. I wasn't, you'd think that it would be very distressing because of the children that were involved, losing their mom, and I thought about all that in that moment. But when I was up on the ceiling immediately after I said, I must be dead, I realized that someone was there with me. And I can't name who that person was because I felt so close to them. I felt that I'd known them for so long, like for eternity. And I had no reason to look over to see if they were there physically. I mean, like, I wasn't there physically, obviously, and I don't think that I had a body or anything up on the ceiling, but I felt this amazing connection to whoever it was that was next to me, and I began to talk to them very calmly about how, and as I was watching the resuscitation efforts unfold down below, how I wanted to go back to that life. And I explained, that my 3-month-old and 8-year-old would need me and that their lives would be forever changed if I left at this point, and that I wanted to help them grow into, beautiful human beings. And I also mentioned that I had not completed my work on Earth, that I had a purpose and I hadn't done it yet. And my feeling with talking wasn't at all insistence. It was more of a request to whoever it was that was up there with me. And I felt instinctively that they had the ability to make what I was asking to have done come true. So I watched as the resuscitation effort was happening below, and there were people coming in and out of the room, and quite a bit of activity and noise. And there was an oxygen mask that was placed on my face and an oxygen cart that was wheeled in next to me. And then a man came in with a small box, and he placed it on a ledge next to the x-ray table. And as I was looking down and I was, mentally telepathy talking to the being next to me, that was the only thing that triggered me on down below, is that I didn't know what that man was doing with the box. And I actually said, "Now, what is that? What is he doing?" And in the moment that I said that, I was then moved from the ceiling vantage point above the x-ray table to right in front of the box that he had placed on the ledge, and he hadn't turned it on yet. He was placing things on my chest, and it was a heart monitor, and I didn't recognize what it was until he turned it on, and the little green ball of light, went straight across the screen, and then it started back on the left side and traversed the screen again, and the third time it did that, and it was making this monotone humming sound, beep, I went, "Oh my God, that's one of those machines that test your heart, and it's supposed to be going deep sleep." So I hadn't had much medical issues prior, and so and I don't watch TV, so I was kind of like, oh. And when I realized that was a heart monitor, then the minute I did, I was back on the ceiling again. So I don't know if I chose to move or if I was moved just to get that answer. But as I was still on the ceiling talking with the being and continuing to carry on my reasons why I wanted to go back, the neurosurgeon that was in the room and the orthopedic surgeon that were doing the surgery the next day were talking because they felt that the defib unit was taking too long to get into the room. And they hadn't, the defib unit, it was 1987, they didn't have them, and this was an x-ray room, so there was no reason for them to believe that somebody was going to need it in that room. And so they were deciding to do something else. And the orthopedic surgeon said, "Stand clear." And the people around the table that were helping with the resuscitation effort stepped back, and he stepped forward, and he struck me with full force with his fist right in the center of my chest. And, of course, I'm on the ceiling. I don't feel anything, but it was, pretty shocking to see him blow his hand into my chest. And the second time that he did that, my eyes shot from up on the ceiling, and I immediately opened my eyes in my body, and I was looking up into his face. He had just struck me the second time. And I had the oxygen mask on my face, and I flipped my eyes open, and I started talking into the oxygen mask. "Oh, my God, I'm back." And the nurse said, "Please, we need to stabilize you. Don't talk." And so I could barely contain myself. I was so excited. And so I waited until they took the oxygen mask off, and I just blurted out everything, and I was so excited and happy, and I was up on the ceiling, and I saw and heard everything. And, of course, the neurosurgeon, who's very well known in Santa Barbara, he's standing there, and he just goes, "Oh, brother." And I was so excited and thrilled to have had that, just gotten my choice to go back, and I was going to be with my children and my husband again.
Of course.
And I bubbled out with, "Oh, no, it really was true. I was up on the ceiling. She's the person who did this, brought in the oxygen mask. That man hooked up a heart monitor. I saw it was flatlining." And I explained another couple of things that people had done in the room. And then I turned to the two doctors and I said, "And you said this, and you said that, and then you replied, and then you said," and then he stepped forward 2 steps, said, "Stand clear," and struck my chest twice, and I'm back. And the whole room just stood there with no comment, and the neurosurgeon turned white. I watched him, just the blood drain out of his face, and he then just got very upset, and he said, I'm not going to stand here and listen to this. And he stormed out of the room. The orthopedic surgeon who'd struck my chest, he stayed with me and asked me more questions like, what else did you see? And so for the next 5 minutes, he spoke with me and calmed me and comforted me. But then when they moved me up to a room to await the surgery the next day that they were doing on my back, not a single person in the hospital would respond to any of my questions. The doctors in the days to come, after they did the surgery the next day, would refuse to talk to me about what happened. And I was trying to put it in perspective what had happened. How did I get out of my body, and how did I see all that? And I was just asking for some sort of confirmation, and no one would talk to me. And I later realized that it was because of the fear that they had of the liability for the hospital themselves. But it left me very, unsure of what to say about what had happened. And my husband at the time said, well, if they won't talk to you about it, it probably didn't happen. And so I just felt very closed down, and I didn't talk about it for 15 years. That was very hard because at first it just was really difficult. I wanted answers. But after a while, I just let it go, and I raised my family, and I went on, and it was a nurse at my local hospital that was a friend of mine, and we were at a gymnastics meet with our daughters, and her mom was passing away, and I broke my silence, and I said, I have a story that may make you feel more comfortable about your mom's passing, and I would tell you that story if you'd like me to. And she said, well, sure. And after I told her the story, she said, do you know that you are explaining something that you couldn't possibly know about? It's something that medical tech would know, but you with no background in medical would not have any clue that this had been done to you. And I said, really? The stroke to my heart? She said, yes, that's trained in medical school, and it's very rarely used, and it's a last-ditch effort, and it's very rarely, positive. The people normally don't come back. It's just it's supposed to shock your heart, and it's supposed to shock your heart into beating, but it doesn't work very often. And she said, I believe what you're telling me. And it was the first time I was just like, oh, my gosh, I think I need to look more into what I had happened. So I ended up looking on websites and finding a website that had a lot of other near-death experiences. And, of course, the Internet had come into being. And so I had this search capacity that I didn't have back in 1987. And I ended up connecting with Jeffrey Long with the Near-Death Experience Research Foundation and his website, and he ended up connecting me to IANDS, and I went to a conference, and that started a beautiful relationship between IANDS and myself.
Which conference did you go to?
It was
what was your first one?
It was the San Diego conference. I believe that was 2008.
Yes, very good.
Yeah, and it was very enlightening because of many reasons, but one of the major reasons was the very first night at the conference, there were a number of people, and I had no idea who they were. And I was actually a little scared to be there. I was still not quite comfortable with my near-death experience and a little afraid to talk about it. I didn't quite know how to put it in perspective yet. And there were a number of people standing in a circle with Jeffrey Long and his wife Jody, and I had no idea who they were, but it was Raymond Moody and it was PMH Atwater, and these are, key figures in the near-death experience research area, and a number of about 4 other people, and they were talking about the after effects of an NDE, and that was the theme of the conference. And as I listened to them talk, I kept thinking, wait a minute, the after effects that they're naming, I've had those all the way back to my earliest memories. Why would they have anything to do with my near-death experience when I was 31? Intuition, lack of fear of death, problems with electromagnetic, turning lights off when I walk into a room, or things like very odd things like that. Mm-hmm. I was just like, wait a minute. I've had those all the way since I was a child. And so I was listening as they were talking, and at the end of the conversation, and they kind of all turned to start talking to each other, I turned to the woman next to me who happened to be PMH Atwater, and I said, I just don't understand. And I posed the question to her, why would I have the after effects prior to the NDE? And she took my hands and she said, dear, I think you ought to check into your background when you were young and see if there was any incident that might have been an NDE when you were quite young. And, at the time I thought, oh, my gosh, I can't believe these people think we have more than one of these in our lives. and I remember, answering politely and saying, oh, thank you, and then, oh, gosh. And so as I went through the conference, though, that planted a seed, and I kept thinking, was there anything that I could remember? And there wasn't anything that was a major trauma to me as a child. And so I was had a trip planned to go up to Oregon to see an older brother about a month after the conference, and he didn't know about my near-death experience at age 31, so he had no possibility of, I didn't tell the rest of my family or anybody. And so I said to my brother, I'm doing a medical background on myself and medical history all the way back to birth, and I remember when I did this event, and I remember when I had that cast on my leg, and so can you remember anything else that I should add into that medical history? And he said, well, let me think about it. And so we were having dinner, and our families were talking and laughing, and after the end of the dinner, he came over and he stood next to me and he said, I do remember something, Barbie, and I was actually told when I was young not to tell you this. And he said, nobody talked to you about it, but when you were 18 months old, you had a very high fever. You were sick with something that he said, I don't remember what it was, whether it was measles or mumps or whatever. And he said, you had a very high fever and you went into convulsions and you stopped breathing. So the parents called whatever it was at that time in 1958, 911. I mean, it's probably the fire department that they called or something. And the fire department, whoever there was, the person on the other end of the line said, you need to put the baby's body in tepid bath water, and you need to then add ice cubes and slowly lower the body temperature of the child until the ambulance can get there. So my parents were doing that, but unfortunately, we had one tray of ice cubes, and so my brothers that were 10 years older than me and 8 years older than me were sent to the neighbors' houses to get their ice. And when my brothers came back and were watching as my mom was holding me in the bath water, my brother said I had turned completely dark purple by that time, and that I was lifeless. And my mom had had some nursing training, and so she was sobbing, and my father was on the phone with, the number that he'd called. And he said spontaneously, as he was standing there in the door watching the situation, he said spontaneously, I took a large breath, and I arched my back at the same time, and then I burst into crying. And I went from purple to red because I was still feverish. And he said that right at that point, the ambulance had just pulled up in front of the house. They could hear the sirens winding down, and the two ambulance guys came in the house, and they, my brother was pushed aside, and he didn't see how they stabilized me, but they took me off in the ambulance, and 3 days later I came home and I was fine. So I'm pretty sure that I had an original NDE at 18 months old, because the after effects are the telltale signs of that. And answering that question, I kind of had that in the back of my mind all my years of my life. Why did I have this intuition? My mom was a police officer, and she used to say, do not tell anyone that you can do this. Please don't talk about it. And so I really didn't know why I was different in that way, and how I didn't look at it as a gift. It didn't feel, good to me to be able to know these things. I didn't know how to put it in perspective, and no one was helping me put it in perspective. So I kind of wanted to, bury those things and not know that I knew when the car accident was going to happen in the intersection that we were standing, on the side of the street, and saying, I didn't want to know those things. I wanted to turn it off. And so, having the information about having the near-death experience as a child and understanding the after effects, that one conference really helped a lot in putting into perspective my early years and all of those aspects, and it gave me a lot of understanding about why I had been different than my other four siblings and all the other kids that I knew. So it helped amazingly, and I really thank IANDS for being there for people, and, I just would like to help make it more readily available to people, because so many people are not aware that IANDS exists and all of the services that they provide. So I'm definitely on board with helping the world to understand, especially medical professionals, mental health professionals, caregivers, hospice workers, those people that encounter someone with a near-death experience and can help them assimilate it into their life a lot earlier than I had the ability to do.
Yes, isn't it a shame that it took 15 years for you to be able to acknowledge that NDE experience?
It does. It made, changes to who I was. I believe that from early on, my the way I looked at life was so different than people, and it would have helped me very strongly to know that came from somewhere. And I just didn't fit in where I lived and where I grew up, and where I was just not, I was really very caring about people, and I had a lot of the signs of an NDEer, and it's just sad that those people that have these are shut down. And now the information with the internet is so much greater, and with media coming out and very clearly outlining Eben Alexander's story, and Dr.
Yes.
Mary Neal's story, and Anita Morjani's story, and little Colton Burpo with the new movie that's coming out. This helps people the world over to understand. Hopefully they'll not be as skeptical as some, but to at least, have the door open for NDEs to be a possibility. And then when they talk to someone who has had one, to keep an open mind about it, and those people that have had an NDE to investigate what it means to them personally.
Mm-hmm. Now, Barbara, you were raised Christian.
I was.
Has your NDE experience influenced the way you practice your religion? Or what sort of reaction have you gotten from church people that you've talked to about this?
Well, I have to say that raised Christian isn't quite. My family did not go to church, but as a 5-year-old, I absolutely knew that God existed. Mm-hmm. And my grandmother went to church, but she lived 50 miles away, so I had a little bit of influence about that. But I actually ended up in a preschool at a church, or a kindergarten class at a church, which I absolutely latched on to the feeling that I was in God's home. I didn't latch on to religion, weirdly, all through the years. And in fact, I very rarely read the Bible, but I latched on to the community of the church because I felt love, very much love towards God, and I felt like that was like an extra family for me. So I ended up going to church when my parents never went to church all through my growing up years, and joined, a Young Life when I was in high school, and so my parents actually looked at me kind of askew, like, where did she come from? And so I had a personal relationship with God, but it really didn't matter which church that I went to, because I could walk into the Catholic Church and feel just as comfortable as the Baptist Church or the Presbyterian Church or the Buddhist. I went anywhere that any of my friends asked me to go. Mm-hmm. And that was very interesting, because when I had the NDE, and after I started assimilating it, that many years later, I realized that the connection that I had to God always felt straight through to Him. I didn't feel as though it had to go through any institution that I attended, religious institution, religious anywhere. I felt so connected that I realized that I didn't need. It was a couple of years later, and I had been going to church really regularly, and I realized, what, I'm kind of past the point where I need the other people to support me anymore. And I really don't need the community of people. And I feel very perfectly fine with praying, anywhere I am in any situation. And I don't attend church anymore. So it's really been an interesting change in my life to not attend church anymore. But I feel very comfortable with it. And I feel like it served me for the years that I needed it. And I really think churches do a wonderful job. But I just personally felt that the connection was straight through, and I didn't need that anymore.
Well, you draw some community connection through your local IANDS group, which you started.
Correct, and I've been in Santa Barbara for over 30 years, so I have a huge community of people, and I've been very active in lots of volunteering and nonprofit work. So I have, a big circle of people here in Santa Barbara. But one of the other things that is important to understand is that we really need to work with our own physicians and our own, like if your parent is passing over, talk with them. And if you understand NDE information, even at a smaller level, at a basic level, talk with your people that are there, the caregivers, or with your elderly parents, or anybody that you come into contact with, because opening up that discussion and giving them the opportunity then to, find out whether, your parent maybe is staring off into the corner of the room and saying, Aunt Martha, or something. They could be seeing the other side prior to their passing over. And having a caregiver or someone in the room that's supportive of that other side and consciousness continuing situation, that outlook, that's really important, I think, to give to those people who are passing over. And that's a really important feature also for people who are grieving the loss of a loved one, or facing, cancer, imminent death, or something. They need to know that consciousness continues, and that it's just not to be feared. Death is not to be feared.
My thanks once again to Barbara Bartolome for sharing her life-changing experiences and for all the work she has done through her life to promote the understanding of NDEs. And thanks to all of you for listening. If you'd like to hear this show again, or any of our more than 500 archived, ad-free NDE interviews, go to TalkZone's NDE Radio site and hit the Past Shows button, or go to our YouTube channel, NDE Radio with Lee Witting, where you can subscribe to and comment on the complete NDE Radio library. And listen next Monday, 11 a.m. Eastern at TalkZone, for more NDE Radio. I'm your host, Lee Witting, saying once again, thanks for listening.